All right, so I definitely thought that I had included these words of Brandon and this part of the discussion in my last video on void binding, and somehow, after finding them, I managed not to. So Jafu, thank you for reminding me of the explicit question, what is void binding? I'm going to try again, take two, to walk us through what we get some hints at, particularly from Argent of 17th Shards, questions over the years. We'll see that in a second. But I'm going to start here. Spoilers for the magic systems of the Stormlight Archive, and little light spoilers. If you haven't finished, I would say Words of Radiance at minimum. There's going to be some spoilers about particular characters who have access to particular magics. So if that scares you away, certainly if you've read Rhythm of War, you're way caught up in terms of what we might be talking about. So this one was one I shared in the cultivation video. How many magic systems are in the Stormlight Archive? The major one you haven't seen is Void Binding. Depends on how you count them. I count Fabrials as one, Surge Binding as one, and Void Binding as one. And the old magic is kind of its own weird thing. Though remember in the cultivation video, he also mentioned maybe Fabrials aren't their own magic system. That's because I think cultivation and Fabrial are basically the same magic system, just doing it differently, kind of like the medallions. That'd be spoilers. We're not going to talk about the medallions. But there are medallions in the Cosmere that do things. So, somewhere. Let's look at the next word of Brandon, though. To see the future originates with the unmade. Void binding is a dark and evil thing, and the soul of it was to try to divine the future. That's a quote from one of the books. And then it says, is it therefore safe to assume that void binding by extension also originates with the unmade? Not always, but usually. So that was one of the words of Brandon I was really sourcing in my last video on void binding when I was talking about them being connected to the unmade, and maybe perhaps even being related to the aethers, in that they require this sacrifice. The unmade, a person has to die for there to be a death rattle. The thrill, you're kind of giving up control in order to gain that extra power. So let's keep looking though. All right, for this one, this is where Argent comes into it. Void binding and what Renarin does, we are still very confused about how much. I am happy that you are very confused about that, because I haven't explained it very much. Okay, and Renarin didn't figure it out very much. And he hasn't figured it out much. Yeah, and we're not even sure whether he's a void binder. Yes, he's probably a void binder, right? But I'm not going to ask you that, because you're going to say Rapho. Yup. Now, what we can say most certainly is that there Brandon is saying he would Rapho that question. He's not saying that Renarin is a void binder, but it seems to be heading in that direction. There's something going on there where Gliss is similar in concept to what is going on with void binding. Let's see one more. So this is a year before Argent, again, earlier, trying to talk to Brandon. Let's talk about Renarin and Void Binding. So with that page we talked about, that's the Void Binding chart I showed in the last video. I'll show that again in a minute. Renarin Void Binds. I asked about visions. You pointed to Void Binding chart. I think he Void Binds. Is that using Stormlight to power abilities different from the Surge Bindings we've seen? Yes. Is that what Void Binding is? No, but close. You're on the right track. We are going to get into that. I'm not going to tell you what the chart means and things like that. But yeah, something really weird is happening there. So again, here's that void binding chart with the different void bindings. In my last video, I theorized the two symbols in the middle might refer to the powers that are able to grant bindings to others, to other vestiture, basically access to the fused for what they do. Now, whether that's called void binding or not, again, seems to be up for debate. Certainly, we don't have an official answer on that yet. There's a lot of theorizing to be done. But if what Renarin is doing is akin to void binding, which it seems like Argent was able to get Brandon to confirm at least back in 2017, with a little bit of waffling in 2018, then given that he has access to that through Gliss, through the effects of Ja'anat, one of the unmade. The theory would be, he said earlier in one of the other words of Brandon, that void binding occasionally, but not always, comes from or is connected to the unmade. Then that would seem to indicate that there is some connection between void binding and the unmade. Which there being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 symbols here in the larger space would seem to indicate that that's the 9 unmade plus odium. that's giving rise to those powers, with the two in the middle being the source of the investiture, in the same way that Stormlight, Voidlight would come from a gem heart, gemstone out to the others. So that's my theory there. I think that Voidbinding is going to be connected in some way to the powers of the Unmade, but that's just where I'm hanging my hat at the moment. I do think, even with the words of Brandon that we have, which there are not many that touch on Voidbinding, we're still going to have to wait. And my guess is that we're going to be waiting until maybe some hints in the interludes, maybe some hints in the epigraphs. But it's really going to be that back half when we know that Renarin is going to be one of the main characters, that we're really going to dig into the magic system that he's relying upon and others are relying upon there. So that's where I'm taking my flag in the ground.